The bright side of addiction is recovery, and recovery is an American way of life. Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Scott, and if you are new to this podcast, we certainly welcome you. If you've been here before, thank you for listening, and welcome back. And if you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or you simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you. We carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured interviews with rock and roll legend Dion DiMucci, actor John Larroquette, Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, and an archived interview from 42 years ago with former First Lady Betty Ford. Plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery, sharing their story, their insight, their path. Now, in this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, an interview with a person in long-term recovery for 37 grateful years, who has carried the message of hope and the promise of recovery to people near and far, all around the world, in fact, including Russia. Here's a quick clip from today's podcast.
I went to Volgograd, originally Stalingrad. There was only one 12-step program. A few years before that, they had tried AA, and it lasted a while and unfolded. Same with NA, Al-Anon. The only program, the 12-step program they had was Nar-Anon, of all things. They had also started this movement called Mothers Against Drugs. These women had looked for help for their kids, and they were laughed at and turned away. And they started the movement against drugs and became a political force in Russia. And, these women did a lot of work to advance treatment, and they didn't really have any treatment in that city. Their best answer was they were loading people in buses and hauling them off to this faith healer in Odessa.
My conversation with Steve Berger coming up next. And then we'll conclude our podcast with some reflections on hope from Rolling Stone guitarist Ronnie Wood. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org. If you'd like to help us out financially, or you know of a foundation or a business that might be interested in underwriting part of all of our program, we would be ever so grateful. A reminder, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We would love to hear from you. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by Sundown M Ranch. They are one of the oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs in America. They're listed in Newsweek magazine's recent list of America's top treatment providers. Treatment for addictive disease is serious stuff, and for many, it's life or death. So where you go for treatment and who actually does the treatment is paramount. Now, some of the ads for treatment centers that you may see on TV or the internet make it look like you're going to a spa or a resort, and it's going to be a good time. And those treatment centers are usually very, very expensive. Treatment should be evidence-based. It should be designed for the individual. Sundown M Ranch has been successfully treating individuals, including adolescents and their families, for nearly 60 years. That's a long time. Sundown has an excellent nationwide reputation, having treated some 200,000 adults, adolescents, and family members. They are truly on the forefront of addiction treatment in America. They are one of the founding members of NAATP. That's the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers, leading the way to recovery since the late 70s with humility and authority, justice, ethics, advocacy, integrity, community and collaboration, evidence, innovation, and proficiency and professionalism. Sundown espouses all of these values, and they are terribly important when you are considering treatment for yourself or a loved one. Sundown is not fancy or elaborate, but it's really quite nice. It's located in central Washington. They own their own land on 30 acres at the mouth of the beautiful Yakima River Canyon. Sundown is not-for-profit. And as a not-for-profit organization, that allows them to keep their rates low. I've personally referred many individuals to Sundown with amazing results. If you're looking for a successful addiction treatment program, I strongly suggest that when you're looking around, consider Sundown Amaranth Treatment Center. And if you go to their website, sundown.org, you can get a lot more information as well as see photos of their facility. It's where recovery begins, sundown.org. It's time for coffee, at least for me and hopefully for you, or whatever your favorite beverage is. Coffee and conversation time. A chat with Steve Berger, who has been clean and sober for 37 years. His journey is unique. He began dabbling in NA meetings early on, but he continued to use. In 1983, after stumbling into an intervention for his aunt, Eleanor, Steve's mom, desperate for her son to get sober, got him a ticket to a 12-step roundup. Well, the seeds were planted, though he continued to use until May 18th of 1988. That's when things changed, when the flowers finally bloomed. Steve begins the story back in 1983.
I was living in my parents' basement, dealing drugs out of their basement. I pulled up and there were no cars in the driveway. I walked upstairs and there was a whole room full of people, all my relatives. And I thought, this is strange. And poor Aunt Eleanor cornered, and they were doing an intervention. This was 1983, early years of intervention. I remember thinking, better get out of here, I might be next. I took off, and apparently they convinced Aunt Eleanor to go off to the Olympic Treatment Center, which was in Bellingham at the time, Olympic Center, Bellingham. She got sober. She was resentful for a long time, but she stayed sober. And one of the things she wanted to do in 1983, with a few months of sobriety, was she had heard about this AA convention they were going to have in Seaside, Oregon, the North Coast Roundup. Anyway, my parents had been taking Aunt Eleanor to this conference. Anyway, so I'd gone to this one NA meeting, and my mom, apparently she'd been praying for me. So she gave my friend and I a ticket to the North Coast Roundup. And I smoked weed all the way down there. I'd quit drinking and doing, what I thought were the hard drugs a few months before that, in the quest that I had to somehow make life and addiction work, which didn't work. So I went to this conference and, talk about a bizarre experience, not knowing what was going on. People were talking to me. I had no clue what they were talking about. But I went through this whole conference, and while I was there, I didn't use for some reason. And I used as soon as I got back. And I went back to that one meeting I had been to every week. I didn't do anything drastic like stop using or anything like, nothing that drastic. But one night I took another using buddy of mine. Her and I went to this meeting. We used after the meeting. That was May 18th, 1988. And the next morning I woke up, and for the first time I had a conscious thought. I wonder if I can make it through a day and not use. It's the first time I really ever remember even that consideration. Throughout my whole using career, drugs and booze would take me to a place where I was miserable, but the thought of giving it all up never occurred to me. It was, I need to quit using cocaine for a while. Or I would be in another situation where I blacked out and made an ass of myself and embarrassed. Well, I didn't know, but they'd tell me what I did and all this, so I'd quit drinking for a while, or I'd cut back on this, or switch around but this thought, I wonder if I can make it through a whole day and not use. And I remember praying. First time I can remember praying, probably since I'd quit going to church shortly after I'd started using at the age of 14. I was 24 at that time. I went through the day, and I had this schedule, a meeting schedule, and I looked and I saw there was a meeting that night. So I actually went to a meeting by myself, and they passed that sign-up sheet around, and I knew what to write down, that the day before, last day I used, which is what I go by. When you look at AA, they mark the beginning of AA, June 10th, 1935, the last time that Bob took a drink. So that's what I was told to do, and wrote that down, and it meant something. And the next day I went to another meeting and I wrote that same date down. And I just kept doing that. And I wasn't fortunate enough. Nobody suggested I go to treatment. I certainly needed it and probably would have made a lot of progress in my life early on if I had been able to do that. I had a job somehow. Well, I had a job that allowed me to use. I mean, let's face it. I could get up and get loaded in the morning, go to work. I mowed grass at a golf course with a lot of woods around it, so I had pop can pipes that I could wander off in the woods and smoke a little weed to get through to the next hole, kind of thing. So it was a job that enabled me to use. So I'd go to work, I'd get home, I'd go to a meeting, I'd pray to God in the morning to help me make it through that day, go to the meeting, maybe go out to coffee or whatever with people after the meeting, and when I'd go to bed that night, I'd thank God for helping me make it through that day.
Did you keep in touch with the guy who took you to the first meeting?
It's really a sad story that he was never able to get it.
Oh, my goodness.
He was never able to get it. I was actually his counselor twice in treatment after that. And he could never get it for any length of time. Even when we went down to that conference, unbeknownst to me, I had a bag of weed in my, my golf bag. I had quit drinking and using the hard drug. They're all hard drugs. It's all hard.
Yeah.
But I'd been, on that reefer therapy marijuana maintenance program for about 6 months. Actually, that had started when my roommate had overdosed on cocaine, and I did CPR on him for 15 minutes before he came back. And, so I'd quit that drug, but it was this constant trying to make, unbeknownst to me, he had relapsed shortly after he had taken me to that first meeting, and he had a 1/4 ounce of cocaine under his hat. He never got it, tried a few times, ended up getting into a fight with his ex-wife's fiance and dying in the fight. Yeah, sad story, a lot of sad stories. That woman that the last time I used, her name was Sandy, beautiful young woman, struggled with this addiction. She went missing about 15, 18 years ago or something, and she was gone, she'd been missing for 9 years. They found her skull in the mountains east of Seattle. It's just, I can look back on so many of these people that were my only friends, and most of them are no longer around. So he's one example of that, sadly. I'm grateful to him. Somebody that was more put together, I don't know if I would have ended up at that first meeting. Another guy that was at that first meeting, he was sober a long time, had a relapse, which lasted a number of years, made it back to recovery, and I think he probably has 10, 12 years and has a sober living. He has like 50 beds of people. So, there's a success story. And there's a lot of success stories, and we gotta hold on to those.
You are a success story. Do you understand that?
Thank you. Yes. And what I hold on to today, I've been fortunate enough to work in the field. I was at a little seminar one time where a woman talked about a spiritual experience as knowing exactly why you're in the spot you're at that very moment. And I've had a number of those. A few years ago, I was asked to speak at a Narcotics Anonymous conference in Kazan, Russia. And I had done a lot of volunteer work back in the 1990s, including trying to get 12-step programs started and carrying the message to professionals in the field, narcologists and government officials and different things in Russia. And it really made a lot of effort back then, and they tracked me down. I managed to be able to be the speaker there and to share my experiences. The first time I went to Russia in 1995, there was one group in Moscow that met twice a week with about 20 members, and there was one group in St. Petersburg that had, I think, 5 meetings a week and also about 20, 30 members. And it had been around for about 5 years in St. Petersburg and I think 3 years in Moscow. And I remember sharing at one of those meetings, I look forward to coming back when there's going to be 100 meetings a week in Moscow, And they looked at me like I was from Mars. At least at that point, this was 6 months before the invasion of Ukraine. That conference, there were 3,500 people. I think there were 3,000 in attendance, and, that was in the middle of COVID, and there were like 500 on Zoom. And they told me there were 1,500 meetings of NA across Russia and the former Soviet bloc.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I was able to share my experiences of the different cities that I went to and tried to get, recovery going. In 1996, I hosted a group of doctors that were kind of heads of large hospital-based programs. I hosted them here in the Seattle area, and we did a seminar at Providence Hospital, a couple of different treatment centers. I actually took them to the North Coast Roundup at Seaside, the AA.
Oh, wow.
And, I don't know how much headway I got, but I look at that as maybe it opened a door to where if somebody came later and asked if they could start an AA meeting in their facility, that maybe they were open to that. That was, maybe that's the only thing that I accomplished in that. But we never know where those seeds are going to be planted.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, take me back to, again, May of 1988. And how did you get from May of 1988 to working in the field of addictions, helping other people find what you found?
Okay, so I mentioned my program of choice. I felt an identity there that I didn't quite feel in AA. But my first sponsor, who actually was that guy that I talked about at that first meeting, they directed me to him. He directed me at that time to attend AA meetings, and even though he had started the first NA meeting in our area, he said, well, yeah, you need to go to NA meetings, but if you want to learn French, you don't go learn it from a Cajun. And the truth is, NA at that time, it's not true anymore, by the way, but at that time, that guy was 7 years. That was unheard of in my area. I come from, Bellingham, Washington, and the county, Whatcom County. We're not talking about a thriving metropolis here. Somebody with 2 years clean in that fellowship at that time was a spiritual astronaut, You kind of had to go to AA at that time and place, to hear people with long-term recovery. It was a necessity. I'd meet a few people here and there in different locations that might have more time. And that's not true today. There's a group of NA in my area that, usually about 20 people, and probably the average amount of clean time is 20, 25 years. There's people there with 40, 44, 45 years that only go to NA. So that's what was true back then is not so true anymore. I got involved in service, and at that time, I think I was going to area service and being a GSR with like 4 months of recovery. I was the area chair for hospitals and institutions at 9 months of recovery. So I was going into institutions, carrying panels in there, sharing my experience. A couple of guys that were at one of my very first meetings, they suggested I come and hang out on Fridays when I had a day off from my job mowing grass at the golf course to hang out with them at the treatment center they were working at. In my recollection, it's kind of humorous now, but that treatment center was like an early attempt at a boutique high-end treatment center. It was actually a mansion that was built by Randy Bachman from Bachman Turner Overdrive.
Really?
Yes. And
wow.
after he was divorced or whatever, it got sold, and some guys whose kids had gone through treatment bought the place and started a treatment program there. And it was a few years along at that point, and that's where my friend had gone to treatment that tried to save me. And so I'd go hang out on Fridays. I'd sit in on the early morning group, and also look at, the professionals at that time. These were people with 2, 3 years in recovery, maybe 5, 6, 7 years in recovery, and they were the pioneers in the field really back then. And they all were in recovery, and they wore that openly. I would see them in meetings. That's how it was there. There's movements away from that, which I think is tragic. People are advised in their, if they go to school to become an addiction counselor, a substance use disorder professional, whatever you want to call it, they're advised not to go to meetings where they might run into a client, and all this nonsense. Hopefully part of our recovery is to learn boundaries. So if I happen to be at a meeting and I see a client there, I'm probably not going to dump out everything that's going on in my life and talk about the divorce I'm going through and my problems in business or this and that. I know how to share recovery in a general way. I think it's wonderful if a client sees their counselor in a meeting. Some folks are not being told that in the learning process. But so these were people that were active in recovery, and they knew how to help people maneuver into a mindset to accept recovery, to find that surrender.
When did you realize you wanted to do that?
We'd go to that morning session, and Friday was recreation day. So we'd go hang out. We'd go bowling or go on a walk. We live in my opinion, one of the most beautiful places on earth with the Cascade Mountains right here and everything, the beach. So we'd go on these little outings and I'd connect with the people. And I mentioned the H&I work I did with my fellowship of choice. I was pretty good at 12-stepping people. I remember one time I was at a very early morning 12-step meeting, and I wandered outside for a second, and there was a drunk laying there, and I got him to go into the meeting with me. And then, he was obviously in danger of withdrawal, and I called up the local detox. I had gotten his name out of there, and she goes, "What in the hell is he doing in Fairhaven?" Which is kind of a higher-end neighborhood in Bellingham. And we got him a ride to detox. I kind of had a little bit of a gift with connecting with newcomers, and that volunteer opportunity opened up to, what they call a res tech now. And so I started actually working there, like the night watchman, this kind of thing. And then when I had a year, I got a job there and started school. So that's it. So I was working in the field at the age of 25. And several years ago, I had an opportunity to take over an agency that I'd been contracting with that was for many, many years, had been a DUI assessment agency only. And I took over the agency. Basically, I inherited a name, a brand, and a telephone number, and decided to start doing treatment rather than just assessments at that particular agency. And I'd already had some sober living going on. And at this point, we have a intensive outpatient, PHP, sober living, and really an opportunity to impact people. And that's what I've strived for all along. I've worked in places that I feel made a huge impact on people, and then I've worked in situations where I feel we could have done a better job. For me, taking all these experiences of working for the last 36 years in the field and trying to really give people what they need that's kind of my goal.
What is the name of your program?
Contact Counseling Recovery Services.
Tell me, Steve, how is your recovery different today than it was 10 years ago?
That's an interesting question. Well, the place I'm at in life is very different. I'm in a relationship with a woman that I really care about, that I love. She's able to give and receive in a relationship. I haven't always been that fortunate. Sometimes I was kind of the caretaker. So it's a mutual relationship where there's give and take. I think I'm able to walk with a higher level of wisdom. Of course, as we approach the later stages of life, I heard Lori Dwinell say something at a conference a few years ago, there's less margin for error.
I often say life is like a roll of toilet paper. The closer it gets to the end, the faster it goes.
There is that. And also, the more precious those last few pieces.
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't have added that. But I have a desire to leave a bit of a legacy. Sharing at that convention in Russia, it was like, okay, I had a piece of this. And the person that introduced me, she was one of the founders of NA, in Russia. So in 1997, I went to Volgograd, originally Stalingrad. There was only one 12-step program. A few years before that, they had tried AA, and it lasted a while and unfolded. Same with NA, Al-Anon. The only program, the 12-step program they had was Nar-Anon, of all things. They had also started this movement called Mothers Against Drugs. These women had looked for help for their kids, and they were laughed at and turned away. And they started the movement against drugs and became a political force in Russia. And, these women did a lot of work to advance treatment, and they didn't really have any treatment in that city. Their best answer was they were loading people in buses and hauling them off to this faith healer in Odessa. Well, obviously, it was a cult. But they had an Nar-Anon meeting. They had me come and speak, and then they had a question and answer period. And remember this woman asking me, what should I do when my son holds a knife to my throat demanding money? In any family groups I'd led in the USA, I'd never had that question asked. I mean, the brutality of addiction and what these folks were going through was, and there was no treatment available, no real treatment. Their idea was to lock them up really in these, narcological hospitals, which
warehouses.
I went to one, hospital number 17 in Moscow, 5,000 alcoholics, and their answer was to inject them with some sort of form of anabuse or something, So at that convention, I shared about being in that Nar-Anon meeting, and after the meeting, this woman came up to me in tears, and she said, my mother was at that Nar-Anon meeting that you shared at. She said, I wasn't ready then yet, but I now have 22 years clean.
Wow.
Yeah. So we never know what we might share might be carried on, or maybe it was just that mother held a little bit of hope.
What year was that, your first trip?
1995.
Yeah, I was there in 83.
Wow.
When they just opened up.
Yeah.
I was at Hospital 17.
Yes.
Yeah, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes. The first trip in 95 when I went there were, I think, 19 alcoholics and one drug addict. And the drug addict, this guy started crying. He says he'd never met a drug addict that was clean. And he was from, Chechnya. That little thread that we can make where somebody can have a little ray of hope that it at least is possible for an addict to get clean. The power of that, you think back, June 10th, 1935, when Bob had that last drink, to what it is now, where all around the world, or the story in Iran. Iran has the largest fellowship outside the United States. NA in Iran is larger than the rest of the world combined as far as the number of addicts in recovery in Narcotics Anonymous.
Really?
Yes. There's a story that you can Google, The Crescent and the Needle, which talks about a couple of people on the world board with NA got invited to go to Iran, and they were expecting, what would be typical, to go and find, 20 people, that want to know how to carry the message and all this, and they arrive at 3 a.m. and they want to go to their hotel room. Well, no, you're going to be speaking first. And they pull up to a soccer stadium with 25,000 people in the audience.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's incredible.
What is the name of that article again?
It's the Crescent and the Needle. It's amazing.
And I assume that was in Tehran?
Yes.
One of the beautiful things about 12-step meetings, whether it's NAAA, Nar-Anon, they're all over the freaking world.
Yes.
No matter where you go, you can find a room full of friends that you haven't met yet.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. And we meet people from time to time, and I have a friend who, I've mentioned this many times on the podcast, who's a singer-songwriter from Asheville, North Carolina. And he wrote a song that has had so much meaning to me over probably over 40 years, and it's called We Are Each Other's Angels. And the verse is, we are each other's angels, we meet when it is time. We keep each other going, we show each other signs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens in this field,
Yes.
in this fellowship.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes.
There
isn't anything else like it anywhere I've found.
What does recovery mean to you today, Steve?
Number one, if I have to stay clean. I mean, if I don't do that, nothing else is assured unless I have that. So I need to remain active, in recovery. And that means attending meetings still. I can't give it away unless I have to have something to give away. So I have to maintain my own recovery. My own recovery is trying to hold on to that gratitude for where I'm at this moment, and to be present for the people in my life. Early in recovery, it's looking back and going, okay, I'm better than I was yesterday. If I think I'm having a bad day, was it as bad as it was, May 18th, 1988 when I used for the last time? Probably not. I know it's not, because no matter what I'm going through, recovery gives me is this understanding that it's going to be okay. If I'm going through relationship problems or, whatever it is, or problems with my kids, I can hand it to my higher power and have this understanding that everything's going to work out. One of the people I met early in recovery in the Seattle area that was big in NA was Earl C. Earl had a lot of, they call them Earlisms, I remember one he said, he goes, I have yet to meet somebody that's starved to death in Narcotics Anonymous.
One last question about spirituality. How important is it in your recovery?
It's really important to understand that I'm not in charge, that God's in charge. When I can realize that, I'm much less important at that point. Early on in recovery, I had more of a religious understanding of spirituality. That is no longer true. So for me, it boils down to learning to love myself, allowing other people to love me, and being able to find the love in myself for other people. And that leads to the understanding. So my higher power is love. Of course, I can forget that on a daily basis, but for me, it comes down to that. So when I want to be judgmental, and I can be judgmental and cynical and all those negative, all those shortcomings and defects of character, but if I can turn to the prayer of St. Francis and realize that I need to understand where people are coming from, to turn that all around, because, we have, I remember probably the first time I heard it was from Clancy I, that this is a disease of perception. That's always the case. No matter what I'm going through, it's my perception. And, getting back to that place of love and understanding and kindness and empathy is always where the answer is. And, it's which master do I want to serve? Is it faith or is it fear? We're going through some fearful time in this current situation on a political level, on every level. It's easy to get overcome with fear. But, having that faith through these times is of course always the answer. And that's important to me. Maintaining that faith is the answer.
I appreciate you recovering out loud, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Steve. He continues to carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path you've chosen, and as long as you've been in recovery continuously for a year or more, drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We can arrange for a phone interview. Coming up next, rock and roll legend Ronnie Wood, member of the Rolling Stones for the past 50 years, reflecting on hope.
We wasted a lot of years hoping, praying for things to get better. I was desperate to save our family. That's when I made the contact.
She contacted Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized alcohol and drug treatment program teaches family members how to break down the barriers of denial. They are taught the skills needed to deal with addiction as a family.
Now we're making up for lost time. It was the best contact I ever made.
Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, let's hear from rock and roll guitarist Ronnie Wood, who's been with the Rolling Stones for the past 50 years. And during that time, it included 6 stints in treatment. Sometimes it takes a lot of treatment to get well. His journey is fueled by hope.
Now, maybe people that are in the program can't get to a meeting. I just want to share something with you today from one of my books that helped me get through every day. This one is I'd like to share on hope. I will share my hope for the future with myself, my higher power, and my friends. I will also share this with someone who has lost hope. Now, if anything, we have tended to be people who wanted it all now. To hope is not to demand. Maybe we were a bit demanding. Maybe we were a bit impatient. Maybe that's why we had such little hope. Hope is believing good will come, even in bad times. Hope is knowing that this too shall pass. Hope is knowing that no matter how afraid we are, our higher power will be with us. Hope is knowing we never have to be alone again. It is knowing that time is on our side. Hope is giving up control. Hope is knowing we never had control in the first place. Hope is believing in ourselves. Hope is what our program is all about. Higher power, in our program we share our experiences, our strengths and our hopes. Thank you for giving all 3 of these to me to share. So I hope this helps you get through another day.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, a national podcast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please share it with at least one other person. You can find all of our podcasts, by the way, at recoverycoasttocoast, one word, .org. If you'd like to get in touch, our email again, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Also, please hit the subscribe or follow button. That's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. By the way, if you missed my interview with Addiction and Recovery eBulletin that I mentioned in the last podcast, I'll go ahead and post that again in the podcast notes. If you're considering treatment for a friend or a loved one, be sure and visit NAATP.org/AID. That stands for the Addiction Information Directory. It's a list of those treatment programs that adhere to the strict ethical guidelines. One of them is Sundown M Ranch, but there's thousands of other good treatment programs around the country as well. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, the good folks at Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. Sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and always be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.